There was a moment when I knew this would happen. I could feel it in the air, the tension building the moment I decided to share my heart with my father. I wasn't foolish enough to think that he'd easily accept my choice of partner. He had built his life on principles, rules, and control. He believed in a certain order, a certain path that one had to follow to achieve success, and above all, respect. I knew that my decision to bring a woman into his world who didn't fit the mold would be met with resistance, but even knowing that, I wasn't prepared for the harshness of his words. The moment I shared my plans with him, I saw his expression change, the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He had already decided what he thought was right for me, and no matter how much I tried to explain, it wasn't going to change. "She's not the kind of woman you marry," he said, the coldness in his voice cutting deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the words. It was the finality in them. It felt as though he had already made up his mind, as though the choice I was making, the woman I loved, didn't even matter. It was as if everything I felt, everything I believed, had no weight. Just like that, the battle started, and I knew the stakes were high. He wasn't a man who made decisions lightly, nor did he ever back down from them once they were made. His world was one of perfection, where everything had its place, and every decision needed to be logical, strategic. He didn't want weaknesses in his life. He saw them as flaws that could threaten everything he worked so hard for. To him, she was a mistake, not because of who she was as a person, but because she didn't fit into the narrow framework he believed in. She wasn't from the same background, she didn't have the right connections, and she certainly wasn't someone he would have chosen for me. She was independent, headstrong, unapologetically herself, everything that stood in contrast to his ideals. "You'll regret this," he warned me. "Love isn't enough. One day, you'll see that you're making a choice you can't take back." Each word he spoke was like a knife. But the sting wasn't because I doubted my love for her. It was because I knew in that moment that this wasn't just about her or me. It was about my father, his legacy, his expectations. It was about the years of being groomed to follow a certain path, to fulfill a specific role, and suddenly, this one decision was challenging everything. The weight of his words, the certainty in his tone, made it feel as though he was testing me. He wanted to see if I would fold under the pressure, if I would walk away from the woman who held my heart. But he didn't know what I knew. He didn't understand how she made me feel, alive, like I mattered for the first time, not just as a name or a symbol of a legacy, but as a person with my own desires, my own dreams. When the world became too heavy, she was the one who reminded me how to breathe, how to live. She wasn't just a person to love. She was the person who made everything else make sense. I knew that love isn't something that can be measured or controlled by anyone's expectations. It's not about status or approval. It's about finding that person who makes everything worth it. And for me, that person was her. But now I was faced with a choice that would change everything. If I decided to continue with this relationship, I knew I might lose my father forever. His words echoed in my mind, sharp and unforgiving. "She's not the kind of woman you marry," he said. "You'll regret this choice." It felt as though he was already condemning me, as if he believed I would come to my senses one day and realize that I was wrong, that I had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. It would have been easier if he had shouted, if he had shown some sort of raw emotion, if he had lost his temper as he sometimes did when things didn't go his way. But he didn't. He was calm, cold, collected, like he had already accepted that I would make the wrong choice, that I would eventually come crawling back, admitting that he was right all along. But he didn't know her. He didn't know us. He didn't see the way she made me feel. And yet, she stood there, quietly watching me. She hadn't said much since I told her about the conversation. She didn't ask me to fight back. She didn't beg me to convince my father that he was wrong. She just stood there waiting, because she knew what this meant. She knew that my decision wasn't just about love. It was about everything I had been raised to believe. The legacy that had always been placed on my shoulders, the weight of my father's name, the world that he had carefully crafted for me. And yet, she didn't ask me to choose her over my family. She understood that if I made that choice, I might be closing a door that would never open again. She wasn't demanding anything from me. She just wanted to know if I was strong enough to make the decision. I met her gaze, and in that moment, I knew. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't a question of what was easier. It wasn't a matter of who had more power or influence. It was about what felt right, what felt real. I could walk away. I could take the easy route, step back into the life my father had planned for me, marry someone who fit the mold, someone who would make my father happy, someone who met all the logical criteria. But I knew, deep down, that if I did that, I would lose myself. I could fight for the woman who had become my everything, the woman who had become my future. The decision wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. But in that moment, there was no doubt. I turned to face my father. His eyes were still sharp, his expression unchanged. I love you, but I can't live my life based on your approval, I told him, my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. His eyes didn't soften. There was no acknowledgement, no sign that he understood. But I knew what I had just done. I had made my choice, and I had made it with certainty. The silence between us was heavy, like a storm that refused to pass. I could see the disappointment in his eyes. It wasn't anger, but it was something just as painful. A finality that I couldn't undo. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to win his approval. I wasn't trying to convince him that my choice was right. I was just telling him the truth. I had chosen her, and I wasn't going to back down. He didn't say anything for a long while. I could feel the pressure building, the tension between us growing thicker. Finally, he spoke. His voice was sharp, but eerily calm. You really think you know better than me? I looked him in the eye. I think I know what makes me happy, I said, the words coming out with more conviction than I had ever felt before. There was no hesitation, no doubt. And then she spoke, her hand still in mine. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. She had always known that this was my fight, that I had to be the one to make the choice. But as I looked at her, I realized something. No matter what my father thought, no matter what consequences I would face, I had already made my decision the moment I fell in love with her. The final blow came swiftly, as if he had been waiting for it. If you marry her, don't expect me to be there, he said, his voice cold, final. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. A promise that he would cut me off, that he would choose to let go of me if I went through with this. I took a breath, but there was no hesitation. Then I guess that's your choice, Dad. Just like this is mine. And with those words, everything shifted. The tension in the room was unbearable. The weight of the decision, the gravity of what I had just done, settled heavily in my chest. I knew there was no turning back now. My father had made his statement, and I had made mine. There was no pride in his eyes when he looked at me, no sense of understanding, no sign that he had accepted my choice. He turned and walked away, his silence louder than any words he could have spoken. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about love, it was about identity. It was about the life I wanted to live, the legacy I wanted to carry forward. And in that moment I knew without a doubt that the woman standing beside me was my future. And no matter what my father thought, I wouldn't let her go. As I stood there, my hand still in hers, I knew one thing for certain. I had made the right choice, and I would make it again, every time.